My wife forgot my 50th birthday. She asked for $25K for her brother. I sent $1. I canceled her cards. Then detectives knocked on the door with a photo of her covered in fake bruises. I just pointed to the open folder on my desk. And what they saw, I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is George, and I turned 50 on a Tuesday in March. I remember the exact date because it was the day I finally stopped making excuses for my wife. I woke up that morning with the kind of quiet excitement you get when you're expecting something good to happen, not a surprise party or anything elaborate, just acknowledgement. Maybe Angela would have made my favorite coffee or left a card on the kitchen counter or even just said the words "Happy Birthday" when she saw me. Simple things that couples do for each other after 22 years of marriage. Instead, I found her already dressed for work at 6:30 in the morning, rushing around the kitchen like she was late for something urgent. Her hair was pulled back in that severe bun she wore when she was stressed, and she had her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed tones to someone I couldn't identify. "Good morning," I said, hoping she'd remember what day it was. She glanced at me briefly, covering the phone with her hand. "I have to leave early today. There's leftover pizza in the fridge if you want breakfast." Leftover pizza on my 50th birthday. I watched her grab her purse and head toward the garage, still talking on that phone. She paused at the door, and for a moment I thought she'd remembered. She turned back to me with this expression I'd been seeing more often lately, like she was looking at a stranger who'd wandered into her house by mistake. "Don't wait up tonight. I'll be working late." The garage door closed behind her with a mechanical whir that seemed to echo through the empty house. I stood there in my pajamas, holding a cold cup of coffee, wondering when exactly I'd become invisible in my own marriage. But this wasn't new, was it? That's what started bothering me as the day went on. Sitting in my home office, trying to focus on work emails, I kept thinking about the past few months. Angela's late nights had become routine, her phone calls in hushed voices, the way she'd started keeping her phone face down on surfaces, something she'd never done before. There was the time 3 weeks earlier when she'd claimed to be at her book club, but when I'd driven past the usual location to grab takeout from the restaurant next door, the parking lot was empty. The building was dark. I'd convinced myself that maybe they'd changed venues, that I'd misunderstood. Then there was her sudden interest in fitness. Angela had never been one for exercise, but suddenly she was hitting the gym 5 nights a week. She'd come home energized, almost glowing, but when I'd suggested, "We work out together," she'd dismissed the idea quickly. "I need this time for myself," she'd said. "You wouldn't understand." I'd tried to understand. I really had. I'd read articles about midlife changes, about women rediscovering themselves. I'd given her space, supported her new interests, never questioned the hours or the secrecy. I'd been the understanding husband, the one who didn't ask too many questions. The birthday she forgot wasn't just about a date on the calendar. It was about feeling like I was living with a stranger who happened to share my last name. By afternoon, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. I opened her laptop. Angela had left it on the kitchen counter, plugged in but closed. She'd been in such a rush that morning that she'd forgotten to take it with her. The screensaver was still logged in under her account. My hands shook slightly as I moved the mouse. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I'd look for 5 minutes and then feel guilty about invading her privacy. But what I found in those first 5 minutes made my stomach drop. Her browser history told a story I wasn't prepared for. Searches for how to start over at 45, articles about divorce after 20 years, website visits to a local law firm that specialized in family law. The timestamps showed these searches happening late at night when she was supposedly reading or watching television beside me in bed. There were other things, too. Email confirmations for restaurant reservations I'd never heard about, receipts for lingerie purchases that I'd never seen her wear, a saved map route to an address across town that meant nothing to me. I closed the laptop and walked away, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat on our back deck, staring at the garden Angela had planted when we first moved into this house 15 years ago. The roses were blooming, bright red against the green fence we'd painted together that first summer. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt real anymore. When Angela came home that night, it was past 10 o'clock. I was reading in the living room, pretending to be absorbed in a book I couldn't remember the title of. She walked through the front door like it was any other day, kicking off her heels and dropping her purse on the hallway table. "How was your day?" she asked, the same question she'd asked 1,000 times before. I looked up at her, this woman I'd been married to for over 2 decades, and realized I was seeing her clearly for the first time in months. The way she avoided eye contact when she spoke to me, how her smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. The careful distance she maintained even when we were in the same room. "It was quiet," I said. "Very quiet." She nodded and headed toward the stairs. "I'm exhausted. I'm going to shower and go to bed." I listened to her footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the bathroom door closing, the rush of water through the pipes. Normal sounds of a normal evening in a normal marriage. Except nothing about this was normal anymore. That night, lying in bed beside her, I made a decision. I was done being the naive husband who believed every excuse, every late meeting, every sudden change in behavior. I was done making myself smaller to accommodate her growing distance. Angela might think she was clever, that her plans were invisible to me, but she'd underestimated something important. After 22 years of marriage, I knew her better than she thought, and if she was playing a game, I was going to learn the rules. I wasn't going to confront her, wasn't going to accuse or demand answers. I was going to watch, listen, and document everything, because something told me that my forgotten 50th birthday was just the beginning of a much bigger revelation. The woman sleeping beside me had no idea that her careless morning rush had left her laptop open, her secrets exposed, and her husband finally dangerously awake. 3 weeks after my birthday, Angela came to me with tears in her eyes and a story about her brother Marcus. I was working in my home office when she knocked on the door, something she rarely did anymore. Usually she'd just walk in or call my name from the hallway. The knock itself felt formal, like we were colleagues rather than spouses. "George, I need to talk to you about something important." She sat down in the chair across from my desk, the same chair where we used to discuss vacation plans and home renovations back when we actually talked to each other about real things. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she had that expression she wore when she was about to ask for something significant. "It's about Marcus," she said, her voice catching slightly. "He's in trouble." Marcus. Her younger brother, who lived somewhere in Colorado, doing something with computers. I'd met him exactly twice in our entire marriage, both times at family reunions, where he'd spent most of his time on his phone, barely acknowledging anyone. Angela rarely talked about him, and when she did, it was usually to complain about how irresponsible he was with money. "What kind of trouble?" I asked, though something in her tone already had me on alert. The tears started then, just enough to make her eyes glassy without actually spilling over. "He was in an accident, George, a bad one. He needs surgery, and his insurance won't cover it all. The doctors are saying if he doesn't get this operation soon, he could have permanent damage to his spine." I leaned back in my chair, watching her face carefully. In 22 years of marriage, I'd seen Angela cry maybe a dozen times, and never over her brother. She'd always described their relationship as distant but cordial. When their mother had died 3 years ago, Angela had been more irritated by the logistics of the funeral than emotionally affected. "How much does he need?" I asked. $25,000. She said it quickly, like she wanted to get the number out before I could object. "I know it's a lot, George, but he's family. He doesn't have anyone else to ask." $25,000. The exact amount delivered with practiced precision. I'd been doing my homework since the birthday incident. Those late-night browser searches, the mysterious phone calls, the new clothes and gym memberships. I'd started paying attention in ways I never had before, and Angela had become predictable in her unpredictability. "When did this happen?" I asked. 2 days ago. He's been in the hospital since Monday night." Monday night. I remembered Monday night clearly because Angela had come home late again, claiming she'd been at dinner with her friend Sarah. When I'd casually asked about Sarah the next morning, Angela had been vague about details, changing the subject quickly. "Have you talked to the hospital directly?" I continued, keeping my voice neutral. "Sometimes they have payment plans or financial assistance programs." Angela's jaw tightened slightly just for a second, but I caught it. "Marcus already looked into all that. This is the only option, George. Time is critical." I nodded thoughtfully as if I was genuinely considering the request. "What's the name of the hospital? I might be able to make some calls, see if there are other resources available." "St. Mary's Regional Medical Center." She said it without hesitation, like she'd rehearsed it. "In which city?" A pause. Just half a second, but long enough for me to notice. "Denver. The main one in Denver." I made a note on a piece of paper, watching as relief flickered across her face. She thought I was buying the story. "Let me think about this," I said. "25,000 is a significant amount. I'll need to look at our finances, maybe move some investments around." Angela stood up quickly, smoothing down her skirt. "Of course, I understand, but George, please don't take too long. Every day matters with spinal injuries." After she left, I sat staring at that piece of paper, St. Mary's Regional Medical Center, Denver. I opened my laptop and did what any concerned brother-in-law would do. I called the hospital. "I'm calling to check on a patient," I told the receptionist. "Marcus Wheeler. He was admitted Monday night after an accident." There was a pause while she searched. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have any patient by that name currently admitted or recently discharged. Could you check again? Marcus Wheeler, Wheeler. He would have been brought in Monday evening, possibly Tuesday morning." Another pause. "No, sir, no Marcus Wheeler in our system." I thanked her and hung up. Then I called 2 other major hospitals in Denver. Same result, no Marcus Wheeler, no recent accident victims matching his description. The lie was so clean, so complete that I almost admired the audacity of it. But I wasn't done with my investigation. Over the next 2 days, while Angela grew increasingly anxious about my decision, I made more calls. I contacted the insurance company Marcus supposedly worked for, claiming to be updating emergency contact information. They had no employee by that name. I checked public records for recent accidents in the Denver area. Nothing matched Angela's story. Most telling of all, I called Marcus himself. I found his number in Angela's old address book, buried in a drawer she probably thought I'd never look in. When he answered, he sounded perfectly healthy, completely confused by my concern about his accident. "Accident," he said. "George, what are you talking about? I haven't been in any accident. I'm fine. I'm actually calling you from work right now." "Angela told me you were in the hospital. Something about needing surgery for spinal injuries." A long silence. "George, I haven't talked to Angela in 6 months, not since Christmas, and I've never needed any kind of surgery. Are you sure she said it was me?" I hung up without explaining, my hands shaking with rage. $25,000 for a fictional emergency involving a brother who was sitting safely in his office, completely unaware he was supposed to be fighting for his life in a hospital that had never heard of him. That evening, Angela asked about my decision. She was sitting at the kitchen counter, picking at a salad she'd barely touched, trying to look casual while watching my every expression. "I've thought about it," I said, pulling out my phone, "and I want to help Marcus." Her face lit up with what looked like genuine relief. "Thank you, George. I knew you'd understand. Family has to stick together." I opened my banking app and began transferring money. Angela leaned forward, trying to see the screen. "I'm sending it to Marcus directly," I said. "What's his account information?" The relief on her face flickered. "Actually, he asked me to handle it for him. He's still pretty medicated from the pain, you know. It's hard for him to focus on financial things right now." "Of course," I said. "That makes sense." I finished the transfer and showed her the screen. Angela looked at it, and for just a moment her mask slipped. Confusion, then anger, then a forced smile. $1? She said, her voice carefully controlled. "That's right, $1. She stared at me, and I stared back. The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross first. "George, this isn't funny. Marcus needs $25,000. "No," I said quietly. "Marcus doesn't need anything. Marcus is sitting in his office in Colorado, perfectly healthy, wondering why his brother-in-law called asking about an accident that never happened." The color drained from Angela's face. For a moment she looked exactly like what she was, someone who'd been caught in a lie so elaborate that she'd forgotten to check if the foundation was solid. But Angela had always been quick to recover. She straightened her shoulders and shifted tactics. "You called Marcus? George, how could you? He specifically asked me not to worry the family until after the surgery. Now you've upset him for nothing." It was a good try, but she was working without a script now, improvising, and I could see the cracks forming in real time. I stood up and walked to the kitchen drawer where we kept important documents. From the back, behind the warranty papers and instruction manuals, I pulled out a folder I'd been building for the past 3 weeks. "Angela," I said, setting the folder on the counter between us, "we need to talk." She looked at the folder like it was a snake that might strike. "What's that?" 22 years of marriage," I said, "and I finally learned something important. When someone you love starts lying to you, they usually don't stop with just one lie." I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a printout of her browser history from the morning she'd forgotten my birthday. Angela's face went completely white. The game had changed, and this time I was the one setting the rules. The detectives arrived at my door on Friday morning at 7:15, just as I was finishing my first cup of coffee. I watched them through the front window as they walked up the driveway, their badges catching the early sunlight. 2 of them, a woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and a younger man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I'd been expecting them. Not because I'm psychic, but because I'd spent the last 2 days watching Angela's desperation spiral into something dangerous. After I'd shown her that folder on Wednesday night, after she'd seen the printouts of her browser history and the proof that Marcus was perfectly fine, she'd gone completely silent. Not the cold silence I'd grown used to over the past months, but something different, something calculating. Thursday morning, she'd left the house before dawn without saying a word. She'd returned around noon with a story about spending the night at her sister's place, thinking things over. But I'd called her sister Patricia Wednesday night just to test the waters. Patricia had been surprised to hear from me and mentioned that she hadn't seen Angela in weeks. Another lie stacked on top of all the others. Thursday evening, Angela had been different. Nervous, jumpy, checking her phone constantly. She'd barely eaten dinner, claiming she had a headache. When I'd suggested she take something for it, she'd snapped at me in a way that felt theatrical, like she was performing anger rather than feeling it. "I don't need you to take care of me, George. I can handle my own problems." She'd stormed upstairs, and I'd heard her moving around in our bedroom for hours, opening and closing drawers, the muffled sound of phone conversations through the closed door. Around midnight, everything had gone quiet. This morning, she'd been gone when I woke up. Her car was missing from the garage, and there was no note, no text message, nothing to indicate where she'd gone or when she'd be back. But I'd had a feeling I'd be hearing from her soon, just not directly. When the doorbell rang, I set down my coffee and walked calmly to the front door. The female detective held up her badge as I opened it. "Mr. George Hartwell, I'm Detective Martinez. This is Detective Chen. We'd like to speak with you about your wife, Angela Hartwell." I stepped back and gestured for them to come inside. "Of course. Please come in." They followed me into the living room, and I noticed how they both automatically scanned the space, taking in details. The neat furniture, the family photos on the mantel, the general tidiness of a house where 2 people lived separate lives under the same roof. Detective Martinez pulled out a small notebook, while Detective Chen remained standing, his hand resting casually near his belt. They were being careful, professional, but I could see the tension in their postures. "Mr. Hartwell, when was the last time you saw your wife?" "Yesterday evening, around 6:30. She said she had a headache and went upstairs early." "And this morning?" "She was gone when I woke up. Her car's not in the garage. I paused, then asked the question I already knew the answer to. Is Angela all right? Has something happened? Detective Martinez exchanged a look with her partner. Mr. Hartwell, your wife came to the station early this morning with some very serious allegations. She claims that you've been physically abusing her. I felt my expression shift into what I hoped looked like genuine shock. I'm sorry. What? She provided photographic evidence of injuries, Detective Chen said, watching my face carefully. Bruising on her arms, her ribs, her back. She says the abuse has been escalating and she's afraid for her safety. I sat down heavily in my armchair, running a hand through my hair. I don't understand. Angela and I have had our problems lately, but I would never hurt her. Never. Detective Martinez leaned forward slightly. She mentioned that you've been controlling her finances recently, canceling credit cards, limiting her access to accounts. I canceled her cards on Wednesday, I said, after she tried to get $25,000 from me using a fake emergency story about her brother. Both detectives' eyebrows went up at that. Detective Chen pulled out his own notebook. Can you elaborate on that? I told them about Marcus, about the fake hospital story, about the phone calls I'd made to verify her claims. I could see them processing this information, adding it to whatever story Angela had given them. Mr. Hartwell, Detective Martinez said carefully, do you have any documentation of these phone calls you made? Any proof that your wife was lying about her brother's situation? I stood up slowly. Actually, yes, I do. I walked over to my home office, both detectives following at a respectful distance. On my desk was the folder I'd shown Angela 2 nights ago, now considerably thicker. I opened it and pointed to the contents. These are printouts of her browser history from 3 weeks ago, when she left her laptop open. Search histories for divorce attorneys, articles about asset division, questions about domestic violence laws. I turned the pages. These are records of the phone calls I made to Denver hospitals looking for Marcus. None of them had any record of him as a patient. Detective Chen was writing quickly now. And these other documents? Credit card statements showing purchases she's made over the past 2 months, restaurants I've never been to, charged during times when she claimed to be working late or at book club. I pulled out another section. Email confirmations for hotel reservations, receipts for clothing purchases that she's never worn at home. Detective Martinez was studying the papers carefully. Mr. Hartwell, this suggests your wife may have been having an affair. Yes, I said. I believe she has been. And I think the domestic violence allegations are part of a larger plan to make sure she gets everything she wants in a divorce. I reached into the back of the folder and pulled out the piece of evidence I'd been hoping I'd never have to use. A small digital recorder, the kind people use for meetings or lectures. Wednesday night, after I confronted her about the lies, Angela made several phone calls from our bedroom. The walls in this house are thin, and our bedroom is directly above my office. I held up the recorder. I recorded her side of 3 different conversations. Detective Martinez looked at the recorder like it was a loaded gun. Mr. Hartwell, depending on the laws in your state, recording someone without their consent might not be admissible. I understand that, but I think you should listen anyway. I pressed play. Angela's voice filled the room, clear and distinct through the small speaker. No, it has to look believable. Not too severe, but enough to show a pattern. A pause, then. I already planted the seeds about him being controlling with money. The bruises will support that narrative. Another pause, then. Of course I can make them look real. I researched it. Make up some ice packs, maybe a small amount of actual pressure. Nothing that will cause permanent damage. Just enough to photograph well. The recording continued for another minute, Angela's voice calm and calculating as she discussed timing, what story to tell the police, how to make sure I wouldn't be able to defend myself effectively. When it ended, the room was completely silent. Detective Chen looked up from his notebook. Mr. Hartwell, do you have any idea who she was talking to? I pulled out one more document from the folder. Phone records. She's been calling this number regularly for the past 3 months. I pointed to a highlighted number. It belongs to David Morrison. I looked him up online. He's a personal trainer at the gym where Angela claims to have been working out. Detective Martinez was studying the phone records. And you believe Mr. Morrison is involved in this plan? I believe Angela is having an affair with him, and I believe he's been helping her plan this entire scenario. The fake emergency with Marcus was probably meant to give them enough money to disappear together. When that didn't work, they moved to plan B. I walked back over to the folder and pulled out the final piece of evidence, printed screenshots from social media that I'd spent hours tracking down. David Morrison's Instagram account. If you look at the timestamps on these posts, you'll see that he's been at the same locations as Angela on multiple occasions when she claimed to be working late or at book club. I spread out several photos. This one was taken at a restaurant downtown last Tuesday. Angela told me she was working on a big project that night. Detective Chen was examining the photos closely. These could be coincidence. Maybe. But look at this one. I pointed to a photo of David at what appeared to be a hotel pool. This was posted 3 weeks ago. Same day Angela claimed she was at an all-day seminar for work, and if you look carefully at the reflection in his sunglasses, you can see someone taking the photo. Someone with long blonde hair wearing a red dress that I've seen in Angela's closet. Both detectives were silent for a long moment, studying all the evidence spread across my desk. I could see them reassessing everything, recalculating the story they'd come here to investigate. Finally, Detective Martinez closed her notebook. Mr. Hartwell, we're going to need to take this evidence with us. We'll also need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. Of course. And Mr. Hartwell? Detective Chen looked up from the folder. The bruises on your wife's body, in the photographs she provided to us this morning, they're extensive. If what you're suggesting is true, she would have had to inflict significant pain on herself to create them. I thought about the woman who had spent months planning elaborate lies, who had researched divorce laws and domestic violence procedures, who had created an entirely fictional emergency involving her own brother just to steal $25,000 from the man who loved her. Detective, I said quietly, I think you're underestimating what Angela is willing to do to get what she wants. As we prepared to leave for the police station, I took one last look around my home office. The folder that had started as a way to understand my wife's strange behavior had become the evidence that would expose her as someone I'd never really known at all. Angela had made one critical mistake in her planning. She'd assumed I was still the naive, trusting husband who would never question her stories, never dig deeper than the surface of her lies. But that husband had died on his 50th birthday when his wife forgot he existed. The man she was trying to frame was someone entirely different. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaning solution. Detective Martinez led me through a maze of desks and filing cabinets to a small interview room that felt more like a therapist's office than an interrogation chamber. 2 comfortable chairs, a small table, and a recording device that she turned on with practiced efficiency. This is just for documentation purposes, she explained. Everything you tell us will be part of the official record. I'd brought the expanded folder with me, now thick enough to require a rubber band to keep it closed. Over the past week, since I'd first confronted Angela about the fake emergency, I'd been methodically documenting everything I could find. What had started as a husband's desperate attempt to understand his wife's behavior had become something that felt more like a forensic investigation. Mr. Hartwell, let's start with the timeline, Detective Chen said, settling into his chair with a fresh notebook. When did you first suspect your wife was being dishonest with you? I thought back to that Tuesday morning, 3 weeks ago, when Angela had rushed out of the house without acknowledging my birthday. It seemed like such a small thing now compared to everything that had followed. The signs were there for months, I said, but I didn't start paying real attention until my birthday, March 22nd. She'd been acting strangely for weeks before that, but I'd been making excuses for her behavior. I opened the folder and pulled out a printed calendar I'd created, marking significant dates with different colored highlighter. Yellow marks are days when Angela claimed to be working late. Green marks are supposed book club meetings. Blue marks are gym visits. Red marks are days when her behavior was particularly unusual or when I caught her in obvious lies. Detective Martinez leaned forward to study the calendar. The pattern was immediately obvious, even to someone seeing it for the first time. Clusters of colored marks that intensified over the past 3 months, with red marks appearing more and more frequently. This level of documentation suggests you were already suspicious, Detective Chen observed. Were you planning to divorce your wife? No, I said honestly. I was trying to save my marriage. I thought if I could understand what was happening, maybe we could work through it. I never imagined it would lead to this. I pulled out a section of documents I'd compiled just that morning after the detectives had left my house. Phone records, credit card statements, and digital receipts that painted a picture of a woman living a completely separate life. These are Angela's phone records for the past 4 months. This number here, I pointed to David Morrison's highlighted contact, appears over 300 times. Text, messages, phone calls, sometimes lasting hours. Detective Martinez was taking notes rapidly. Did you ever confront your wife about this David Morrison? Not directly, but I did some research on him. I pulled out printouts from various social media accounts and professional websites. David Morrison, 28 years old, personal trainer at Elite Fitness Center, divorced last year. According to his Instagram posts, he's been living well above what a personal trainer's salary should support. I spread out several photos that showed David at expensive restaurants wearing designer clothes, driving a car that cost more than most people make in a year. This is from 2 months ago, I said, pointing to a particular photo. David posted this picture of himself at Morton's Steakhouse downtown. The meal he's eating costs approximately $150 per person. On the same day, Angela's credit card was charged $198 at Morton's. Detective Chen looked up from his notes. You're suggesting your wife was funding this man's lifestyle? I'm suggesting more than that. I pulled out the most damaging evidence I'd found. Angela's been systematically moving money from our joint accounts into a separate account I didn't know existed. Small amounts at first, but increasing over time. The bank statements I'd obtained that morning told a clear story. Over the past 6 months, Angela had transferred a total of $47,000 from our joint savings and checking accounts into an account listed under her maiden name. $47,000, Detective Martinez repeated. Did your wife have legitimate access to these accounts? Yes, we've always had joint accounts. I never questioned her spending before because I trusted her. I felt the bitter irony of those words. But look at the pattern of withdrawals. They correspond exactly with David Morrison's expensive purchases, his car payments, even his rent. I'd spent hours the night before cross-referencing Angela's withdrawals with David's social media posts and public records. The correlation was undeniable. Mr. Hartwell, Detective Chen said carefully, this suggests premeditation. If your wife has been planning this for months, the domestic violence allegations become much more serious. There's more. I pulled out a section of documents I'd hoped I wouldn't have to share. Angela's been researching more than just divorce law. The printouts showed browser histories that went far beyond simple asset division questions. Angela had been studying domestic violence statutes, researching how much evidence was typically required for restraining orders, reading articles about how abuse victims were treated by law enforcement. She researched everything, I continued. How to document injuries, what kind of medical records would be most convincing, even how to make bruises appear more severe in photographs. Detective Martinez looked genuinely disturbed. Mr. Hartwell, you're describing someone who planned to frame you for domestic violence as part of a divorce strategy. I think it was more than that. I pulled out the final piece of evidence, the one that had made me realize just how elaborate Angela's plan really was. I found this hidden in her laptop, buried in a folder labeled Book Club Notes. It was a document that Angela had titled Timeline, but which read more like a criminal's planning notes. The file was 8 pages long and detailed every aspect of what she was calling the transition. I read aloud from the document. Month 1. Establish pattern of George becoming controlling and suspicious. Document his questioning of my activities. Month 2. Create financial pressure that he will resist, establishing foundation for economic abuse claims. Detective Chen was writing furiously as I continued reading. Month 3. Begin documenting alleged abuse. Create photographic evidence. Establish timeline of escalation that will support need for immediate protection order. The document outlined everything Angela had done over the past months and everything she was planning to do. The fake emergency with Marcus, the deliberate lies about working late that she knew I would eventually discover, even the way she'd left her laptop open that first morning, knowing I would find her browser history. She wanted me to find out about the affair, I realized aloud. Not because she wanted to be honest, but because she needed me to react. She needed evidence of me becoming suspicious and controlling. Detective Martinez looked up from the document. And the domestic violence allegations? I turned to the final page of Angela's timeline. Phase 4. Implement physical evidence protocol. Document injuries consistent with ongoing abuse pattern, contact law enforcement, and initiate protective proceedings. The clinical language was chilling. Angela had written about bruising her own body, the same way someone might write about a grocery shopping list. There are detailed notes about how to create convincing injuries, I continued, what household items to use, how to photograph them for maximum impact, even research about healing times and how to make fresh bruises appear older. Detective Chen set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. Mr. Hartwell, if this document is authentic, your wife has essentially confessed to conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false police reports, and potentially perjury. There's one more thing, I said. I pulled out the audio recordings I'd made, but also a second device I'd found hidden in our bedroom. Angela has been recording our conversations for weeks. I found this device taped under our kitchen table. The small recording device was professional quality, the kind used for surveillance. When I'd discovered it 2 days ago, it had contained hours of audio files of our daily conversations, edited and compiled in a way that made me sound controlling, possessive, and prone to anger. She's been creating an audio record that supports her claims, I explained. Conversations taken out of context, edited to remove her provocative comments and leave only my responses. Detective Martinez was studying the device. Mr. Hartwell, this level of planning and deception suggests your wife may have done something like this before. That thought had occurred to me as well. I'd started researching Angela's past relationships, the ones from before we'd met. It was difficult to find information, but what I'd discovered was troubling. Angela was married once before, when she was 22. Brief marriage that ended in a contentious divorce. Her first husband claimed she'd falsely accused him of financial impropriety. I pulled out public records I'd obtained. The charges were eventually dropped, but the divorce settlement was heavily in Angela's favor. The room fell silent as the implications of this information settled in. She's done this before, Detective Chen said. It wasn't a question. I think Angela has been perfecting this strategy for years, learning what works, what doesn't, how to be more convincing each time. I looked at the folder spread across the table, all the evidence of a woman I'd thought I knew but who had been living as a complete stranger under my roof. The woman who came to you this morning with bruises and tears, claiming to be a victim of domestic violence, that's not my wife. That's a performance she's been rehearsing for months. Detective Martinez gathered the documents together. Mr. Hartwell, we're going to need to bring your wife back in for additional questioning. Based on what you've shown us, we have grounds to investigate her for filing a false police report at minimum. What happens now? I asked. Now we verify everything you've told us. We'll contact the hospitals, check your phone records, interview David Morrison. Detective Chen stood up. And we'll take a much closer look at those photographs your wife provided this morning. As we prepared to leave the interview room, Detective Martinez turned to me with a question that had probably been bothering her since she'd first seen my folder. Mr. Hartwell, why didn't you confront your wife directly when you first discovered the affair? Most people would have demanded answers, threatened divorce. Instead, you spent weeks documenting everything in secret. I thought about that for a moment. Because I knew Angela well enough to understand that she was planning something, I just didn't know what. If I'd confronted her too early, she would have adjusted her strategy. I needed to see the whole plan before I could defend myself against it. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to destroy me, Angela had taught me exactly how dangerous she really was. And in trying to be thorough, she'd documented her own crimes so completely that she'd made my defense effortless. Walking out of the police station that afternoon, I realized that the woman I'd been married to for 22 years had never actually existed. The real Angela was someone far more calculating, far more cruel, and far more capable of destruction than I'd ever imagined. But she'd made one critical error in her planning. She'd underestimated the man she was trying to frame. The confrontation happened in the same police station interview room where I'd spent the afternoon laying out the evidence of Angela's deception. Detective Martinez had called me at home around 6 o'clock that evening, asking if I could come back in. They'd brought Angela in for additional questioning, and things had taken an unexpected turn. "She's asking to speak with you," Detective Martinez explained as we walked through the station corridors. "We've presented her with the evidence you provided, and she's claiming there are things we don't understand about your relationship." I wasn't surprised. Angela had always been skilled at shifting narratives when her original story started to fall apart. What surprised me was that she thought this strategy would still work now that her entire elaborate plan had been exposed. "Has she been arrested?" I asked. "Not yet. We're still investigating, but the evidence you provided raises serious questions about the validity of her domestic violence claims." Detective Chen joined us as we approached the interview room. "She's been very insistent that you're manipulating the situation somehow." Through the small window in the door, I could see Angela sitting at the same table where I'd spread out my folder hours earlier. But this wasn't the composed, calculating woman who had tried to steal $25,000 from me just days ago. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and she was clutching a tissue like it was a lifeline. When I entered the room, her head snapped up, and for just a moment I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear, real, genuine fear that she might not be able to talk her way out of this situation. "George," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "thank God you're here. These people don't understand what's been happening between us." I sat down across from her, the same position we'd been in just days ago when she'd told me about Marcus's fake emergency. But this time, the detectives remained in the room, and there was a recording device on the table between us. "Angela," I said calmly, "they showed me the photographs of your injuries. They look very painful." She nodded eagerly, seeing this as validation. "They are painful, George. You don't know how hard this has been for me, living in fear, not knowing when you might lose control again." Detective Martinez leaned forward. "Mrs. Hartwell, your husband has provided us with evidence that suggests these injuries may have been self-inflicted." Angela's face went pale, but she recovered quickly. "That's ridiculous. George has always been manipulative, but I never thought he'd go this far." She turned to me with what looked like genuine anguish. "How could you make them think I would hurt myself? How could you be so cruel?" It was a masterful performance. Even now, if I hadn't spent weeks documenting her lies, if I hadn't seen the timeline document where she'd planned this exact scenario, I might have been tempted to doubt my own conclusions. "Angela," I said quietly, "they found your planning document, the one where you outlined everything you were going to do, including how to create convincing photographic evidence of abuse." She blinked rapidly, and I watched her mind racing, trying to figure out how to explain away something so damning. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally. "George, you're scaring me. This isn't like you." Detective Chen opened a folder and pulled out a printed copy of the timeline document I'd found on Angela's laptop. "Mrs. Hartwell, this document was found on your computer. It's titled Timeline, and details a multi-month plan to frame your husband for domestic violence." Angela stared at the papers, like they were written in a foreign language. "I've never seen this before in my life." "The document was created on your laptop. using your user account over a period of several weeks, Detective Martinez explained. The metadata shows it was last modified 2 days ago. George must have put it there, Angela said desperately. He's been using my computer, going through my things. He's trying to frame me because he knows I found out about his controlling behavior. I felt something inside me shift as I listened to her lie so effortlessly, even when confronted with irrefutable evidence. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was pathological. Angela, I said, they also found the recording device you hid in our kitchen, the one you used to create edited conversations that made me sound abusive. She shook her head violently. No, that's not true. George, why are you doing this to me? Detective Martinez pulled out another piece of evidence. Mrs. Hartwell, we've also verified that your story about your brother Marcus was fabricated. We contacted him directly. He's never been in any accident, never needed surgery, and hasn't spoken to you in 6 months. Angela's breathing was becoming shallow, her hands trembling as she gripped the tissue. You don't understand. Marcus asked me not to involve anyone else. He's very private about medical issues. We spoke to the hospitals, Detective Chen continued relentlessly. St. Mary's Regional Medical Center in Denver has no record of treating any patient named Marcus Wheeler. Neither do any other major medical facilities in the Denver area. Maybe he went somewhere else, Angela said weakly. Maybe I got the hospital name wrong. I watched as her entire fabricated world collapsed around her. Every lie she'd told, every manipulation she'd attempted, was being systematically dismantled by simple fact-checking that she'd somehow convinced herself wouldn't happen. Angela, Detective Martinez said gently, we also need to ask you about David Morrison. The mention of David's name hit Angela like a physical blow. Her face went completely white, and she actually swayed in her chair. I don't know who that is, she whispered. Detective Chen consulted his notes. Mr. Morrison is a personal trainer at Elite Fitness Center. Your phone records show over 300 communications with him over the past 4 months. Your credit card statements show you've spent thousands of dollars on meals and activities that correspond with his social media posts. George is lying about that too, Angela said, but her voice had lost all conviction. He's making up evidence to destroy me. I pulled out my phone and opened David Morrison's Instagram account. Angela, this photo was posted 3 days ago. It shows David at the Marriott Hotel downtown, the same hotel where you claimed to be attending a work seminar when you asked me to cover the cost. She glanced at the phone screen, then looked away quickly. That's a coincidence. And this one? I scrolled to another photo. David posted this yesterday morning. He's wearing a watch that I recognize because I watched you buy it online 2 weeks ago. A Rolex that cost $8,000, charged to our joint credit card. Angela stared at the photo for a long moment, and I could see something breaking inside her. The carefully constructed lies, the elaborate planning, the months of manipulation, all of it crumbling because she'd been sloppy with details. He said it would work, she whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear her. Detective Martinez leaned forward. Who said what would work, Mrs. Hartwell? Angela looked up, and for the first time since I'd known her, her mask came completely off. The tears were gone, the trembling had stopped, and what remained was someone I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. David said nobody would check the details. He said men like George are too trusting, too stupid to investigate their wives' stories. She laughed, a bitter sound that made my skin crawl. He said we could take you for everything and you'd never figure it out until it was too late. The room went silent. Angela seemed to realize what she'd just said, how completely she'd destroyed her own defense, but instead of trying to backtrack, she doubled down. Do you know what it's like being married to someone like you, George? Someone so boring, so predictable, so absolutely ordinary that you feel like you're suffocating every day? Her voice was rising now, all pretense abandoned. 22 years of listening to you talk about work, about your little hobbies, about your pathetic dreams for retirement. 22 years of pretending to be happy with a man who never once surprised me, never once made me feel alive. I felt like I was seeing Angela clearly for the first time in our entire marriage. Not the woman who'd gotten angry about forgotten birthdays or late nights, but someone who had been contemptuous of me from the very beginning. David made me remember what it felt like to be desired, she continued. What it felt like to be with a man who actually wanted me, not just someone who thought marriage was a comfortable arrangement. Detective Chen was writing everything down, but Angela didn't seem to care anymore. The plan was perfect, she said almost admiringly. I would get the money I needed to start over, you would be destroyed financially and legally, and David and I could disappear together. It should have worked. What went wrong? Detective Martinez asked, though I suspected she already knew. Angela looked at me with something approaching respect for the first time in years. George turned out to be smarter than we thought. David said men like him never fight back, never question their wives' stories. We didn't account for him actually investigating. She leaned back in her chair, looking almost relieved to have finally told the truth. The bruises were my idea, she said matter-of-factly. David thought they were too extreme, but I knew they had to be convincing. I researched the best methods, practiced the placement. It hurt, but it was worth it for the photographs. Detective Martinez was staring at Angela like she was looking at something inhuman. Mrs. Hartwell, you're confessing to filing false police reports, conspiracy to commit fraud, and potentially extortion. Angela shrugged. What's the point in lying now? George has documented everything anyway. I underestimated him, and now I'm going to pay for it. She turned to me one last time, and her voice was almost conversational. You know what the really funny part is, George? If you'd just given me the $25,000 and not asked questions, none of this would have happened. David and I would have been long gone, and you never would have known why. I looked at this woman I'd been married to for over 2 decades, this stranger who had been planning my destruction while sleeping in my bed every night, and felt something I'd never felt before. Not anger, not betrayal, but a profound sense of relief. Angela, I said quietly, I'm glad I finally got to meet you. Detective Chen stood up. Mrs. Hartwell, you're under arrest for filing false police reports and conspiracy to commit fraud. As they led her away in handcuffs, Angela looked back at me one last time. George, she called out, you're going to regret this. You're going to spend the rest of your life alone, and you'll realize that being boring was the worst thing you could be. I watched the door close behind her and felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of freedom. For the first time in months, I knew exactly who I was dealing with. 6 months after Angela's arrest, I was sitting on my back deck at sunset. Drinking coffee from the mug she used to complain was too ugly for company. The garden she'd planted 15 years ago was overgrown now, wild roses climbing the fence in tangled profusion, but somehow it looked more beautiful than it ever had when she'd maintained it with ruthless precision. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for years. Not the suffocating silence of 2 people avoiding each other, but the peaceful quiet of a man who no longer had to wonder what lies were being crafted in the room next door. The legal proceedings had been swift once Angela's confession was recorded. She'd pled guilty to filing false police reports, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted extortion. The judge had sentenced her to 18 months in prison and ordered her to pay restitution for the $47,000 she'd stolen from our accounts. David Morrison had been charged as a co-conspirator and received a similar sentence. I'd testified at the sentencing hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but because the prosecutor had asked me to explain the emotional and financial impact of Angela's crimes. Standing in that courtroom, looking at the woman who had shared my bed while planning my destruction, I'd felt something unexpected. Pity. Your Honor, I'd said, I want you to understand that this wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was a systematic, calculated attempt to destroy another person's life for financial gain. Mrs. Hartwell spent months researching, planning, and executing a scheme that could have resulted in my imprisonment, bankruptcy, and complete social destruction. Angela had sat at the defendant's table, staring straight ahead, showing no emotion as I described the timeline document, the fake emergency, the self-inflicted injuries. When the judge had asked if she wanted to make a statement before sentencing, she'd simply said, "I have nothing to add." Even then, even facing the consequences of her actions, she couldn't bring herself to apologize or show genuine remorse. It was as if the entire proceeding was just another inconvenience, another obstacle that someone else had placed in her path. The divorce had been finalized 2 months after her sentencing. With Angela's criminal conviction and the evidence of her systematic deception, the proceedings were straightforward. I'd kept the house, the retirement accounts, and most of our shared assets. Angela's attorney had argued that she deserved spousal support, but given her conviction for attempting to defraud me, the judge had been unsympathetic. "Mr. Hartwell," the judge had said during the final hearing, "I want to commend you for the thorough documentation that helped expose this scheme. Your methodical approach likely prevented a serious miscarriage of justice." I'd nodded, but what I'd thought was, if I hadn't been so trusting for so long, I might have seen who Angela really was years earlier. The strangest part of the whole experience had been discovering how many people had suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how to tell me. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars in my driveway when I was supposedly at work. My brother had asked if everything was okay at home because Angela had seemed different at family gatherings over the past year. "She was always polite," he'd told me after the trial, "but there was something cold about it, like she was acting the part of your wife instead of actually being your wife." Looking back, I realized that Angela's performance had been slipping for months before I'd finally started paying attention. The signs had been there for anyone who cared to look, but I'd been so invested in believing our marriage was solid that I'd ignored evidence that was right in front of me. The hardest part hadn't been the betrayal itself, but accepting how completely I'd misunderstood the woman I'd lived with for over 2 decades. Every memory from our marriage was now suspect. Had she ever actually loved me? Or had I always been just a means to an end? Had there been other schemes, other lies that I'd never discovered? I'd found a therapist, Dr. Sarah Williams, who specialized in helping people recover from manipulative relationships. Our sessions had been illuminating in ways that were sometimes painful. "George," she'd said during one of our early meetings, "you keep talking about how you should have seen the signs earlier, but the signs you're describing, the emotional distance, the secretiveness, the lying, these aren't normal relationship problems that you failed to address. These are symptoms of someone with a serious personality disorder." She'd explained that people like Angela were skilled at creating what she called manufactured intimacy. Relationships that felt real but were actually carefully constructed performances designed to serve the manipulator's needs. "You weren't naive or stupid," Dr. Williams had told me. "You were dealing with someone who had spent years perfecting the art of deception. Most people in your situation would have been equally deceived." Those sessions had helped me understand that Angela's behavior wasn't a reflection of my worth as a husband or as a person. It was a reflection of her inability to form genuine emotional connections with anyone. The revelation that had affected me most deeply came when Detective Martinez had called me 3 months after Angela's sentencing. They'd been investigating David Morrison's background and had discovered that Angela wasn't his first victim. "Mr. Hartwell, we found evidence that Morrison has been involved in at least 2 similar schemes over the past 5 years. He targets married women who have access to significant assets, then helps them orchestrate elaborate fraud schemes against their husbands." The detective had explained that David was part of a loose network of people who specialized in what they called intimate fraud, using romantic relationships to facilitate financial crimes. "Your wife may have thought she was David's partner," Detective Martinez had continued, "but the evidence suggests she was just another mark. He would have taken the money and disappeared, leaving her to face the legal consequences alone." I'd asked if Angela knew this, and the detective had said probably not. Even in her scheme to betray me, Angela had been betrayed herself. There was something almost poetic about that revelation. Angela had destroyed our marriage and attempted to destroy my life in pursuit of a relationship that was itself a lie. She'd sacrificed everything real for something that was never going to give her what she wanted. Now, sitting in my garden as the sun set behind the overgrown roses, I found myself thinking about the man I'd been 6 months ago. The husband who made excuses for his wife's behavior, who trusted without question, who assumed that love meant never investigating, never doubting, never protecting yourself from the person who shared your bed. That man was gone, and I didn't miss him. I'd learned to enjoy my own company in ways I hadn't since I was a young man. I'd started reading again, not just the business journals and news sites that had filled my time when I was married, but novels and philosophy books that made me think about larger questions. I'd taken up photography, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my instincts. When something felt wrong, when someone's story didn't add up, when my gut told me that I wasn't getting the whole truth, I listened to those warnings instead of dismissing them as paranoia or jealousy. I wasn't bitter about the experience, which surprised people who knew the details of what Angela had done. But bitterness would have meant carrying her toxicity forward into my new life, and I'd already wasted enough years doing that without knowing it. The phone rang as I was finishing my coffee, and I glanced at the caller ID. It was my brother Mark, who'd been checking on me regularly since the trial. "How are you doing, George?" "I'm good," I said, and meant it. Really good. "Any regrets about not taking her back? She's going to be out of prison in about a year." I laughed, not with bitterness, but with genuine amusement at the question. "Mark, taking Angela back would be like inviting a burglar to house sit while I went on vacation. Some people can be forgiven and rehabilitated, others are just dangerous." "Fair enough. What are you doing tonight?" I looked around my peaceful backyard, at the book waiting for me on the side table, at the camera I'd left on the deck railing after taking photos of the sunset. "Nothing special," I said, "and it's perfect." After I hung up, I sat for a while longer as the stars came out. I thought about Angela, probably lying in a prison bunk somewhere, still convinced that she was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own destruction. I hoped that someday she'd find whatever help she needed to become a person capable of genuine relationships, but I knew that wasn't my responsibility anymore. I'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the recognition that some people can't be saved, can't be changed, and can't be trusted, no matter how much you might love them or want to believe otherwise. The man who had been married to Angela Hartwell was gone, destroyed by betrayal and deception. But the man who remained, the man sitting peacefully in his own garden on a quiet evening in spring, was someone I was proud to be. For the first time in years, I knew exactly who I was and exactly what I was worth, and I was enough, all by myself,